They begged for aid. But Earth unleashed its Deathworlders. The distress signal hit every frequency at once. I was chewing on a cold protein bar in the lower deck of Kepler Station when every screen on the wall lit up at the same time. Red. The kind of red that means something has gone very wrong, very far away, and someone is out of options. My name is Adriana Reyes, Commander, United Nations Interstellar Expeditionary Force, 9th Shock Division. I have been doing this job for 14 years. I have heard distress signals before, but this one was different because it was not coming from a human ship or a human colony. It was coming from the Vareth Council, and the Vareth did not ask for help. Ever. I put down my protein bar. The signal was being played on a loop through every communication channel on the station. The voice was calm, precise, and formal in the way that only someone who is quietly terrified can manage. The speaker identified himself as High Envoy Sue of the Vareth Collective, and he was announcing that their homeworld, Vethara, was under siege by the Krath Dominion. He said the Krath had already taken 3 of their outer territories. He said the Vareth Defense Forces had held for 6 months and could not hold much longer. He said the Council was formally requesting military assistance from any allied species willing to respond. Then he said something that made everyone in the room go very still. He said the Krath had never lost a war. I finished reading the full transcript while the rest of the station erupted around me. Officers were moving fast down corridors. Screens were showing star maps with red pushing inward from the edges. The Krath Dominion was large, old, and had been expanding for 200 years. Every species they had encountered had either submitted or been removed from the galactic record. The Vareth were one of the most advanced civilizations in this region of space, and they were calling for help with the same quiet desperation of someone who has just realized that being smart is not the same as being able to stop something that wants to end you. I was already pulling up my command terminal when Colonel Harlan Webb found me. Webb was a big man, broad-shouldered, gray at the temples, with the kind of permanent frown that comes from too many years of making difficult decisions. He pulled up a chair next to me without being asked, and looked at my screen. "You already read it," he said. "All of it," I said. "Command is convening in 20 minutes. "I know." He looked at the star map for a moment. The red indicators showing Krath territory were not subtle. They were wide and deep and moving. "They want auxiliary forces," he said. "Civilized ones," is how the envoy phrased it. "I caught that," I said. Webb looked at me sideways. "You're smiling." "I'm thinking," I said. The command meeting lasted 4 hours. 12 officers sat around the table and debated whether Earth should respond at all. Some of them pointed out that the Krath had no quarrel with humanity yet. Others pointed out that letting the Vareth fall would bring the Krath significantly closer to human space. There was a long argument about diplomacy, and another long argument about resources, and then someone asked who we would even send. That was the moment I stood up. I pulled up the roster for the 9th Shock Division. I put it on the main screen without comment, and let everyone look at it. The 9th was not a conventional unit. It had been formed from soldiers drawn from the most extreme environments on Earth. Some had come from Antarctic deep field research stations, where they had spent winters in conditions that would stop most living things. Others were from high-altitude mountain units, trained at elevations where breathing itself was work. There were jungle specialists from the Amazon basin who could navigate for weeks without resupply, demolition crews who had worked in active volcanic zones, and a squad of coastal raiders who had trained in waters cold enough to cause system failure in most standard alien biology within minutes of exposure. They were not large soldiers. Some of them were quite ordinary looking. One of the squad leaders, a woman named Petra Hollis, was shorter than the regulation height for most galactic military standards, and had broken 3 bones in her left hand during a training exercise 2 years ago, and had kept working for 4 hours before she mentioned it to anyone. The room was quiet for a moment after I put the roster up. Then Colonel Webb said, "How fast can you have them ready?" "They're already packed," I said. "They're always packed." Webb looked at the screen for another second. Then he looked at me. "The Vareth asked for civilized auxiliary forces." "Yes," I said, "they did." Webb almost smiled. It was the kind of almost smile that meant he understood exactly what was about to happen. "Get them on the ships," he said. I sent the order before I left the room. The drop ships were loaded within 6 hours. 42 soldiers, full kit, 2 weeks of supplies, and equipment that had been designed and tested on Earth's most hostile terrain. I walked the loading bay twice and stopped to check in with each squad. The soldiers were calm in that specific way that only people who have been through genuinely terrible situations can be calm. There was no nervous energy. There was no bravado. There was just readiness, which is a different thing entirely. Sergeant Callum Bright was running his squad through a final equipment check when I stopped next to him. Bright was from the Scottish Highlands originally. He had the kind of face that looked like it had been carved out of something that did not give easily. He was checking his personal kit with the same expression he wore during every task, which was no expression at all. 2-week transit, I said. Heard, he said. The Vareth envoy will be on board for the crossing. General Suwu. Bright glanced up at me. Is he expecting something specific from us? He's expecting something like what the Vareth military looks like, I said. He's going to be surprised. Bright went back to his kit. We're used to that, he said. We were. That was the thing about the 9th. They had been underestimated their whole lives. By environments, by conditions, by circumstances that should have stopped them. They had responded each time the same way. By not stopping. The ships lifted at dawn. Kepler Station shrank behind us through the rear viewport until it was just a point of reflected light. And then it was nothing at all. Ahead of us was 2 weeks of transit space, a burning planet on the other side, and a war that the galaxy's most feared military force was already winning. I went to my bunk, set an alarm for 6 hours, and closed my eyes. I was not afraid. That was not arrogance. It was just that I had been on Earth long enough to know that it had already done its worst to me. Whatever was waiting in the dark on the other side of this transit would have to work very hard to compete with what I had already survived, just by growing up on the planet I was born on. I fell asleep in 4 minutes. The signal was still looping somewhere on the ship's communication feed. The Vareth envoy's calm, terrified voice asking the galaxy for help. But we were already moving, and no one had told High Envoy Su yet exactly what was coming. He would find out soon enough. The first thing Su said to me when we met in the transit ship's main briefing room was not a greeting. It was a question, and the question was delivered with the careful politeness of someone who is working very hard not to look alarmed. He said, "Commander Reyes, are these all of your soldiers?" General Su of the Vareth Collective was tall in the way that most Vareth were tall, which meant he had about 30 centimeters on me, and moved with the deliberate, measured grace of a species that had evolved on a planet with lower gravity than Earth. His skin was a deep blue-gray, his eyes were amber, and he wore his uniform with the kind of precision that suggested he had never once left the house without every button in its correct position. He was also, I could tell, genuinely unsettled, though he was hiding it well. "This is the forward element," I said. 42 soldiers from the 9th Shock Division. He looked at the soldiers filing into the briefing seats behind me. To his credit, he did not say what he was clearly thinking, which was that he had expected more of them, and larger, and perhaps better armed than they appeared. What he said instead was, "I see. And how many additional forces will be joining us at Vethera?" "None," I said. "We are what was sent." The silence that followed was brief, but it had a weight to it. Su sat down slowly across from me and opened the data pad in front of him. He was a military commander. He had read our file. He knew the basic facts about humanity and Earth, but knowing facts about a species and understanding what those facts mean are two very different things, and I had found over the years that the gap between those two things was where most of our conversations with other species tended to live. "I have reviewed your unit's combat record," he said. "Your soldiers have participated in 14 engagements across 7 planetary environments. Your casualty rate is lower than any comparable unit in our coalition forces. I found this interesting, but I attributed it to a small sample." "It's a consistent pattern," I said. He tapped the data pad. "I also reviewed your medical reports. I want to make sure I am reading them correctly. He looked up at me. One of your soldiers, Sergeant Bright, sustained what your own medical classification system labels as a severe tissue injury to his torso during a training exercise and returned to active duty 48 hours later. Is that accurate? Yes. Our medical staff would classify that injury as requiring a minimum of 3 weeks of recovery and restricted movement. He was stiff for a few days, I said. He managed. Sue looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked back at the pad. I have also noted that several of your soldiers have chronic injuries listed in their files that in our species would be grounds for medical discharge. Fused vertebrae, reconstructed joints, bone density variations. Old injuries, I said. They healed. Humans heal differently than we do, he said. We heal quickly when we have to, I said. And we keep going when healing is not an option. He put the pad down and looked at me directly. Commander, I do not mean to be discouraging, but the Krath are not a standard military threat. They have been studied by 6 species before us. They are larger than any of the species I am aware of in this region. They are fast. They are trained from birth as warriors, and they have a psychological tactic that has been effective in every engagement they have ever fought. They project force. When a Krath unit advances, it advances with noise, with presence, with a deliberate display designed to trigger fear responses in opposing forces. Species break. They rout. The Krath have built their entire strategy around the certainty that what they face will eventually break. That is a good strategy, I said. Against most species, he said carefully, it has been definitive. Tell me about the planet, I said. He blinked. He had clearly expected a different response. He collected himself and pulled up the star map. Vethara was a mid-sized world, temperate climate in the central regions, mountainous in the north, coastal lowlands in the south. The Krath had landed in the eastern territories 6 months ago and had been grinding west ever since. They had taken 3 major population centers. They had air superiority in 2 of the 4 main continental zones. The Kelvar Gorge, I said, pointing to a narrow passage between 2 mountain ranges in the central region. That's the choke point. Sue nodded. It is the last defensible position before the Krath can access the central plains. If they breach the gorge, we lose the ability to protect the capital within days. We have been holding it with 4,000 troops. We are losing people every cycle. How many Krath are pushing that approach? Our last count was approximately 400 in the forward assault element, with reinforcements behind. They rotate their forces to keep pressure constant. Our people cannot rest. They are being ground down. 400 in the forward element, I said. Yes, it is a concentrated push. They are trying to break the gorge defense before moving the main force through. I looked at the gorge on the map. I thought about what 42 people could do in a narrow mountain passage against 400 opponents who had been trained to win through psychological pressure. I thought about Callum Bright and Petra Hollis and the rest of the Ninth. I thought about where they had come from, what they had trained in, what their bodies had been put through on a planet that did not ever stop trying to end things that lived on it. We'll take the gorge, I said. Suit stared at me. With 42 soldiers, he said slowly. Yes. Against 400 Krath forward assault troops, plus whatever comes behind them, I said. But we'll deal with that when it arrives. He was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of dismissal, the quiet of someone genuinely trying to recalibrate a calculation that is not giving them a result they expected. Commander, he said carefully, I want to understand something, not your tactics, which I intend to fully support, but you, your people. You were born on a world that your own scientific records classify as a Class 4 hazard environment. Your gravity is higher than what most species consider comfortable. Your atmosphere has particulate and chemical compositions that require filtration for several other species. Your wildlife catalog includes thousands of species that are toxic, venomous, or otherwise physically dangerous. Your weather systems generate phenomena that are capable of destroying permanent structures. And your history, your own internal history, is composed almost entirely of conflict. That's one way to read it, I said. How would you read it? I thought about that for a moment. We had a lot of practice, I said. He was silent again. I could see him putting things together, connecting things he had read in data files to the people sitting behind me in the briefing room. People who had grown up in environments that most species would classify as emergency situations. People who had been shaped by cold and altitude and pressure and weight, and the simple daily fact of existing on a planet that had spent 4 billion years producing things that could end you. The Krath were apex predators. They were large and fast, and they used fear as a tool. But they had never, in their entire history of warfare, faced something that had grown up alongside things just as dangerous as themselves. They had never faced a Deathworlder. Over the next 11 days of transit, I ran the 9th through daily briefings on Krath tactics. We studied their movement patterns, their communication signals, their preferred terrain, and their psychological escalation methods. We ran scenarios. We ran them again. Sergeant Bright ran night navigation exercises in the ship's lower cargo hold, with the lights fully off, which annoyed the maintenance crew, but kept everyone sharp. Petra Hollis spent her spare hours learning what she could of the Vareth terrain maps, tracing the Kelvar Gorge over and over with her finger on the screen until she had it memorized. The Vareth soldiers on the ship watched us from a careful distance. They were not unfriendly, but they were uncertain. They had been told Earth was sending auxiliary forces. They had expected something different. Something, I suspected, that looked more impressive on the outside. On the 12th day of transit, one of the Vareth officers, a young one named Orvith, approached Bright during an exercise and asked him something directly. Bright told me about it later. Orvith had asked, politely but with clear uncertainty, whether the humans were frightened about the Krath. Bright had thought about it for a moment, and then answered honestly. He said he was not frightened exactly. He said it was more like a sort of focus, the kind of clarity you get when something is in front of you and you just have to deal with it. Orvith had not known how to respond to that. He had thanked Bright and walked away looking as though he was still processing something. Bright told me this at dinner and then went back to eating without adding anything else. That was the 9th. No speeches, no posturing, no declarations of confidence or displays of fearlessness. Just the quiet, settled certainty of people who had been prepared for this. Not because someone had trained them for it recently, but because the planet that made them had been preparing them for exactly this kind of situation their entire lives. On the 14th day, we entered the Vethara system. I stood on the bridge and watched the planet come into view through the forward screens. It was blue and green from a distance, a familiar palette, though the land masses were shaped differently than Earth's. There was fire visible in the eastern hemisphere from orbit, smoke rising in columns thick enough to see from space. The Krath had been busy. Behind me, the 9th was suiting up. Sue came to stand beside me on the bridge and looked at the planet without speaking for a moment. When he finally said something, his voice was quieter than it had been in the briefing room. "I want to tell you something, Commander," he said. "Go ahead," I said. "When I sent that signal, I did not know who would answer. I did not know if anyone would answer. The other allied species took longer than us to respond to Krath threats in other regions, and some of them did not respond at all." He paused. "I expected, if anyone came, that they would assess the situation and advise caution. That is what most forces do against the Krath. They advise caution, and then they find reasons not to commit. That is not what we're doing," I said. "No," he said. "I understand that now." He looked at me. "I want to understand why." I thought about it for a moment, not because I did not know the answer, because I wanted to give him the right words for it. "Because you asked," I said, "and because leaving was never going to be an option that sat well with us." He looked at me for a long time. Then he nodded once and looked back at the planet. Below us, on the surface of Vethara, the Krath were pushing toward the Kelvar Gorge with 400 soldiers and the absolute certainty that whatever was in front of them would break. They were wrong about that. But they did not know it yet. The drop was rough. 3 of the landing vessels took fire on the way in. We lost no one, but the 3rd ship, the one carrying Petra Hollis and her squad, came in at an angle that should not have worked, and landed hard enough to crack 2 of the landing struts. Hollis had her people out of the hatch and into cover inside 40 seconds of touchdown. I saw it on the feed from my own ship as we came down 3 kilometers to the west, and I made a note to tell her later that the landing was impressive, even though she would tell me she barely noticed. The Kelvar Gorge was everything the maps had promised. A narrow passage between 2 ridgelines of gray rock, roughly 80 meters wide at the entrance, and tightening to 40 in the middle section, with walls rising on both sides to nearly 200 meters. The Vareth had been holding the entrance with earthworks and defensive positions. Those positions had taken significant damage. The soldiers we found there were exhausted, in a way I recognized immediately. Not tired from one bad night, but worn down by months of it. The kind of tiredness that gets into your bones and does not leave easily. The Vareth commander at the gorge was a woman named Thren. She met me at the entrance of the defensive line, with the controlled expression of someone who had been waiting for reinforcement for a long time, and was not sure whether to feel relieved or not. She looked at the 42 humans deploying around her position, then she looked at me. "This is the reinforcement," she said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," I said. She processed that for a moment. "How would you like to coordinate? Give me a full briefing on the last 3 engagements. Attack patterns, timing, their approach angles, what they responded to, and what they did not." She had the briefing ready in 20 minutes. The Krath had been running what amounted to wave attacks. They would push forward in force, apply overwhelming pressure for a period, then pull back when resistance stiffened. Then they would come again. It was a cycle designed to exhaust defenders over time. The Vareth had been good at holding during the push, but had not been able to recover fully during the pullbacks. The timing was wearing them away. I listened to all of it, and then I went to find Bright and Hollis. We had 6 hours before the next Krath push, based on the pattern Thren had described. I used 3 of those hours to walk the gorge with both of them, from end to end, twice. We did not talk much while we walked. We looked at the rock walls, the elevation changes, the sight lines, the places where the floor of the gorge narrowed and widened, the areas of shadow, and the areas where the morning light would hit at different angles. We looked at it as a landscape, and as a problem, and as a set of possibilities. On the second walkthrough, Bright said, "If they're using noise as part of their psychological approach, the gorge walls will amplify it." "They will," I said. "That works against us, and for us," he said. "Yes," I said, "depending on who's making the noise." Hollis was looking up at the eastern wall. "I can get 6 people up there," she said. "Not easy, but the rock face has enough variation. 2 hours of climbing. Do it in daylight so you're in position before dark," I said. "When do you want them to move?" "Not until I say." She nodded and walked back toward her squad. Bright watched her go and then looked at me. "You're going to let the first wave come all the way in," he said. "Most of the way," I said. He nodded slowly, working through it. "The Vareth won't like that." "No," I said. "Have a conversation with Sergeant Quinn. I want his squad positioned at the rear mouth of the narrowest section. Do not tell the Vareth what that squad is there for yet." Bright went without another word. I spent the next hour talking to Commander Thren. I explained enough of the plan to get her cooperation without explaining the parts I knew would worry her. She was a professional. She understood that new allies sometimes had different approaches. She agreed to pull her own forces to the flanking positions I suggested, and hold them there, regardless of what they saw happening in the center of the gorge. That last part she agreed to with some difficulty. But she agreed. At approximately 2 hours before dawn, the Krath came. We heard them before we saw them. The sound they made was deliberate, a deep rhythmic percussion combined with vocalizations designed to build in volume as they advanced. The gorge walls caught it and threw it back and forth, and I will admit that standing at the center of the gorge at that moment, the sound had a physical quality to it. It moved through the air and into your chest. I saw 2 of the younger Vareth soldiers near me, visibly tense. The soldiers of the 9th did not tense. I watched them in the gray pre-dawn light. Callum Bright was checking the position of the squad to his left. Petra Hollis was somewhere up on the eastern wall, out of sight. Sergeant Quinn's squad was at the rear of the narrow section. Everyone was where they were supposed to be. The Krath came into the gorge entrance in force. They were large. The briefing data had prepared me for their physical size. But data and presence are different things. And seeing 400 of them moving through the entrance of the gorge with that sound building off the walls was something else entirely. They were moving with the confidence of a force that has never needed to be careful. I let them come. The Vareth holding the flanking positions were under strict orders to hold. They held, though it cost them something to do it. The Krath advance unit moved into the gorge, and they moved fast, because there was nothing in front of them but empty ground, and the ghost of positions that had been abandoned. They moved until the lead units were deep in the narrow section. Then I spoke into the communication channel with one word. Hollis and the 6 people on the eastern wall moved first. They were not firing weapons yet. What they did was simpler. They dropped signal flares along the top of the eastern wall, 6 of them in rapid sequence, and the light they produced was sharp and sudden and hit the gorge floor like a wall. The Krath advance paused. In that pause, Quinn's squad activated the acoustic devices we had brought from the ship. The sound they produced was not a weapon sound. It was a very specific low-frequency resonance that we had calibrated in the transit ship, based on the Krath's own communication frequencies, designed to produce a disorientation effect in that specific biology. It was not harmful, but it was very unpleasant. Then Bright's squad and my squad moved in from both sides of the gorge walls at ground level, using the rock face for cover, and what they did was not charge. They moved fast and low and without noise, which was exactly the wrong thing to happen from the perspective of a species that had spent 200 years relying on the certainty that defenders would either stay in position or run. The Krath forward element did not break. They were trained too well for that. But they hesitated, and hesitation in a narrow gorge with acoustic disruption from one direction, light from above, and flanking movement from both sides, is a very different thing from the controlled advance they had been executing 30 seconds earlier. The fighting in the gorge lasted 11 hours. I will not pretend it was clean. It was difficult and close, and there were moments when I was aware that the outcome was not certain. 2 of our soldiers were injured seriously enough to pull back. The rest kept going. Bright took a strike to the shoulder from a Krath impact weapon that would have ended a Vareth soldier's participation in the fight. He switched his weapon to his other hand and kept moving. What the Krath were encountering, for the first time in their military history, was an opponent that their primary psychological tool did not work on. When they projected force, the humans did not break. When they escalated noise and presence, the humans adjusted their tactics and kept coming. When they injured someone, the rest of the unit did not react with fear or retreat. They reacted with a quiet, focused intensity that the Krath had no entry in their tactical doctrine for. I encountered their unit commander personally in the 4th hour of the engagement. He was a Krath named Vreth, a large individual even by their standards, and he came at me in the way that Krath commanders apparently dealt with enemy officers, which was directly and with the expectation that the sight of them would end the encounter quickly. I did not run. I did not slow down. I moved toward him. He stopped. Not from fear, I think. From confusion. Every biological instinct in his body was reading my behavior as wrong. Prey did not move toward a predator with that expression on its face. I have been told that the expression I have in those moments is difficult to describe. People who know me say it looks like I am doing math. We dealt with each other. I will leave the details out. Vreth survived. After the encounter, he pulled back and his unit pulled with him. The sun was coming up over the eastern wall of the gorge when it went quiet. I stood at the gorge entrance and looked out at the Krath forces pulling back into their own lines. My soldiers were securing the position behind me. Someone was helping one of the injured back toward the Vareth medical station. Callum Bright was sitting on a rock, breathing steadily, holding his shoulder, and looking at nothing in particular. Commander Thren appeared beside me. She looked at the retreating Krath, and then she looked at the 41 humans behind me, and then she looked at me. "They have never done that before," she said. "Retreated?" I said. "In this campaign," she said. "In this engagement. They have never pulled back in the middle of a push. Not once. In 8 months." "Noted," I said. She was quiet for a moment. What happened? She said. Not as a tactical question, as something else. I thought about how to answer that. They found something they weren't ready for, I said. She looked at the retreating figures in the distance. What do we do now? We hold the gorge, I said, and we get ready for when they come back. Because they would come back. I had no doubt about that. The Krath were not done. They had only pulled back to think, and thinking was the most dangerous thing a good military force could do after a surprise. But the gorge was ours for now, and the Ninth was already preparing for what came next. The Krath came back with questions instead of noise. That was the first sign that something had changed in their thinking. For 3 days after the gorge engagement, there were probing attacks. Small units, not the overwhelming force they had used before. They came at different angles, at different times, testing. The rhythm of their assault had always been consistent before, built around the certainty that steady pressure would eventually break whatever was in front of them. Now the rhythm was gone, and what replaced it was something more careful. I told Bright that careful was more dangerous. Means they're learning, he said. Yes, I said. Good. I looked at him. He was eating something from a ration pack without looking at it. Good, I said. A threat that's thinking is a threat you can predict, he said. A threat that's just pushing doesn't have a plan. It just pushes until something breaks. When they start thinking, they make choices. And choices can be read. He went back to eating. He was right. But he was also only half right. Krath General Vrethak was thinking, and his thinking was focused on one problem. He had 400 years of Krath military history to work with, and a biological profile that had taken him from the top of his species' military hierarchy. He was not a creature that accepted being confused. He was going to find the edges of what the humans could do, and he was going to push on those edges until something gave. We just had to make sure nothing gave. The political situation inside the Vareth position was not simple. The council had been watching the gorge engagement from the capital, and what they had seen had given them something complicated. It had given them hope, which is a difficult thing when you have been losing for 8 months, because hope and expectation begin to blur together very quickly. High Envoy Su met with me on the 4th day after the first gorge engagement. He was more direct than he had been during the transit. Some of his careful diplomatic distance had been replaced by something more real. The council is pressuring for a political resolution, he said. They've been pressuring for that since before we arrived, I said. Yes, but the gorge engagement has changed the calculus for some of them. There are those who believe that showing the Krath we can hold the gorge creates an opportunity to negotiate from a stronger position. And the Krath will use a negotiation to regroup, reinforce, and come back in 3 months with twice the force, I said. I know that, Su said, but some members of the council believe that any resolution that stops the current loss of life is preferable to continuing. The Krath have taken 3 territories. They will not give them back in a negotiation. All a negotiation gets you is the current border, which means they keep what they took and have a formally recognized line from which to start the next push. Suchu was quiet for a moment. Commander, I agree with your analysis. I need you to help me make that case to the council. They will listen more readily to you right now than to their own military advisors. You have just done something that we told them was impossible. I did not particularly want to spend time on politics, but Su was right that it mattered. Set up the meeting, I said. The council meeting happened 2 days later, via secure transmission from the capital. There were 7 members, and they were all exhausted. 8 months of war does that to a governing body. They had been managing the strain of a campaign they had not expected, and a threat that had been larger than anything in their recent history. When I appeared on their screens, I could see them trying to read me, looking for the version of a military officer they knew how to deal with. I gave them the version they needed instead. You asked for help, I said. We came. We held the gorge with 42 people against a force of 400. We can keep holding it, but only if we are allowed to do this the right way. One of the council members, an older woman named Veleth, leaned forward. Commander Reyes, what the council needs to understand is the long-term cost of continued engagement. What is your assessment of how long this campaign must continue? Until the Krath decide it is not worth continuing, I said. And when will that be? When the cost outweighs what they're gaining, I said. Right now they believe they can still get what they came for. They are adjusting their tactics. That adjustment is because we surprise them at the gorge. But surprise only lasts once. The real work is what comes next. And what comes next? Veleth asked. We make the cost of this campaign impossible to sustain, I said. Not by defeating them in a single engagement, by making every day they stay here more expensive than the day before. The council debated for another hour. There were voices on both sides. But Sue had prepared the room carefully. And in the end, the council voted to allow the military campaign to continue without pursuing a negotiated settlement for the next 30 days. 30 days was not much, but it was something. I left the meeting and went straight back to the gorge. On the 7th day after the first engagement, the Krath came back in force. They came differently this time. They came in darkness, which was new. They split their force into 3 elements, which was also new. And they came quietly, which was the most significant change of all. The noise approach had stopped completely. They had paid attention to what did not work. Now they were trying something else. What they did not account for was that the 9th had spent 6 of the previous 7 nights in the dark gorge, learning it the way soldiers learn terrain they intend to live in for a long time. Bright had his people moving in complete darkness through the gorge paths without difficulty. Hollis had mapped every significant variation in the eastern wall, and had 2 additional people up there who had been up there every night since the first engagement. The Krath entered the gorge in 3 columns. We let the outer 2 columns advance. Quinn's squad took the middle column at the narrowest point, with a contained engagement that lasted 40 minutes, and ended with the Krath middle column pulling back in disorder. The outer columns, hearing the engagement but not seeing it clearly in the dark, lost their timing. When Bright hit the left column from the rear, they were not prepared for it. The engagement lasted 9 hours. The Krath pulled back before dawn with significantly more losses than the first engagement. Vrethok's analysis team spent 2 days going through what had happened. On the 9th day, we intercepted a partial Krath communication. The translation was imperfect, but the substance was clear enough. Vrethok was telling his command structure that the human unit in the gorge was not behaving according to any standard biological response pattern. He said they were not responding to standard pressure signals. He said they appeared to have no coherent fear response to overwhelming force. He said he was requesting data on human physiology from every source available to the Dominion. I read the transcript and felt something I could only describe as satisfaction. He was looking for our edges. The problem was that the edges he was looking for were the edges that Earth had spent billions of years building in us, and they were not the kind of thing you found in a data file. On the 12th day, Vrethok made a mistake. It was not a tactical mistake. It was a strategic one. He struck the Vareth Field Hospital that had been established 3 kilometers behind the gorge defensive line. It was a clear position, marked and registered with the coalition protocols. The Krath had not targeted it in the previous months. Vrethok targeted it now, I believe, because he was looking for a way to change the behavior of the humans in the gorge. He had read enough about human groups to understand that humans had strong responses to harm done to their own. He was trying to create a reaction. He did create a reaction, just not the one he intended. I got the report on the strike at midday. 3 of our soldiers who had been in the medical station for treatment of non-combat related injuries had been there at the time. 2 had gotten out. 1 had not. I read the report. I set it down. I went to where Bright was sitting and told him. He listened. His face did not change. He asked if the person had survived. I told him no. He nodded once and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When do we move?" "Tomorrow night," I said. He nodded again and went back to what he had been doing. That was what Vrethok had not understood about us. He had expected that harming our own would produce grief and anger and possibly recklessness. What it produced instead was a kind of stillness, a narrowing of focus. The 9th went quiet in the hours after the report, not withdrawn, not upset, just very, very focused, like a signal being tuned to a single frequency. The soldiers of the Ninth did not grieve loudly. They grieved by working, by planning, by preparing for what came next, with a precision that made everything preceding it look like a warm-up. I spent the rest of that day with Sue, working through the plan. It was the most ambitious thing we had attempted so far, and it involved moving beyond the gorge for the first time. Sue was concerned. I understood his concern. He had 41 humans, and he had already seen 2 of them seriously injured. Losing more would be difficult. "This is necessary," I said. "I understand the logic," he said. "I want to understand the confidence." "The confidence comes from knowing my people," I said. "And from knowing that we have been doing the harder version of this our whole lives." He looked at me steadily. "The harder version." "Earth," I said simply. "Every day of training, every exercise, every evolution we went through as a species. It was all harder than this." He was quiet for a moment. "That is a remarkable thing to say about a war." "It's a remarkable planet," I said. The plan was set. Tomorrow night, we would stop defending the gorge. We would go find Vrethak. I led the Ninth out of the gorge at 2200 hours, under a sky with no moon. This was the kind of movement the Ninth had been built for. Not standing in a line and waiting for something to hit you. Moving through darkness over hard terrain toward an objective that had no intention of making itself easy to reach. The ground between the gorge and the Krath Forward Command was rough, broken by shallow ravines and scattered rock formations that would have slowed a conventional force significantly. We moved through it at a pace that surprised even Sue's observers, who were watching on thermal feed from a rear position. Bright was at the front. He navigated in the dark the way people do when they have spent years doing it, not thinking about each step, but reading the ground the way you read a familiar text, quickly and without effort. The rest of the squad moved in his trail. Nobody tripped. Nobody made unnecessary noise. The Krath picket lines that Vrethak had established around his command position were significant. 6 outposts, staggered, with overlapping sight lines designed to catch anyone approaching from the direction of the gorge. We did not approach from the direction of the gorge. Hollis took her squad around the long way, 3 hours of extra movement through terrain that climbed 200 meters and dropped again, coming at the command position from the north, from the direction the Krath were using as their supply route. It was the direction they expected no one to come from, because no one was supposed to be behind them. Quinn's squad handled the eastern outposts. I took Bright's squad directly toward the command center from the west, which was the most obvious direction and therefore the one Vrethak had reinforced most heavily. The obvious approach was where he had concentrated his attention. We used that. For 3 hours, in the dark, the Ninth worked through Vrethak's outer defenses with the quiet efficiency of a unit that had been built for exactly this. Not loud engagements, not overwhelming force, just careful, precise, sustained work in the darkness, using the terrain and the night and 40 years of accumulated human experience in exactly this kind of situation. At approximately 3 in the morning, Hollis's squad reached the northern edge of the command position and began the disruption sequence. At the same time, Quinn's people took the eastern flank, and Bright's squad, with me at the rear, went through the western perimeter and into the heart of the Krath command. I found Vrethak in the main command shelter. He was larger up close than he had been in the gorge. He was reading data feeds when I entered. There were 2 members of his personal guard in the room. They moved when I entered and I dealt with them, and then it was just the 2 of us and the hum of the communication equipment. He was calm. I had to give him that. He looked at me with the amber eyes that Krath commanders apparently all shared, and he did not shout for help, because he knew help was occupied. He just looked at me, taking in what I was, trying to understand it. "You hit the hospital," I said. "I was attempting to create a behavioral change in your unit," he said. His galactic standard was precise, formal. "The tactic has worked on other species." "We are not other species," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "I have been reviewing everything available on humanity since the first gorge engagement. Your history, your biology, your planet. I have been trying to find the threshold, the point at which you break." "What did you find?" I said. Very little that is useful, he said. Your planet is classified in our threat database, which I did not know before this campaign, because we had not encountered humans directly. When I read the classification, I believed it was an error. A world that toxic, that heavy, that consistently dangerous to life, should not produce a species that then goes and becomes a spacefaring force. It should eliminate everything on it. It tried, I said. He looked at me steadily. You are saying you survived it. For 4 billion years, I said. Everything on Earth survived it, or it did not survive. There is no middle option. He was quiet. The shelter around us was not quiet. I could hear the sounds of the engagement continuing outside. Hollis and Quinn and Bright's squad working through the Krath defensive positions. The sounds were not the sounds of a losing fight. What are you asking for? Vrethik said. Your withdrawal from Vethara, I said. Full withdrawal. The territories you have taken, returned. A formal cessation of Krath military operations in this system. He looked at me for a long time. He was doing the calculation that commanders do in moments like this, measuring what he still had against what he had already spent, and what it would cost to continue. He was not a fool. He had been receiving reports all night. He knew what the state of his force was. The Dominion will not accept terms from a subordinate species, he said. I am not offering terms from a subordinate species, I said. I am offering them from Earth. We can discuss the distinction at length, or you can contact your command structure and we can move forward. He held my gaze for another long moment. Then he reached for his communication device. Vrethak's formal request to his command structure for authorization to negotiate was transmitted at 4:40 in the morning. The response came back in 12 minutes. The Krath Dominion's High Command reviewed the situation report from Vethara and authorized limited withdrawal negotiations. Limited was not what I had asked for, but it was the beginning. The next 3 days were strange ones. The fighting had stopped at the gorge, paused by a mutual holding signal that both sides had accepted while the broader communications continued. The Krath forces remained in their positions in the eastern territories but did not advance. My people held the gorge and the surrounding area. There was a tense, suspended quality to those days, like the moment between lightning and thunder when you are not sure yet how close the storm is. Sue conducted the formal negotiations with the Krath diplomatic element. I was present at those meetings but said little. This was not my domain. Sue was good at it, precise and steady, never allowing the Krath representatives to reframe the situation in a way that put the Vareth back on the losing side of the argument. The gorge engagement was in the background of every conversation. What had happened there, what 41 humans had done against a force that had never before pulled back in an active campaign, was present in the room without being spoken. It was the most useful argument Sue could have made, and he had not had to make it at all. On the 4th day, the Krath agreed to full withdrawal from Vethara in exchange for a formal boundary agreement that prevented Vareth forces from pursuing them into the outer territories. It was not everything. The outer territories were still contested, but Vethara was clear. The 3 major population centers the Krath had held were returned. The Krath Expeditionary Force began its withdrawal on the morning of the 5th day, organized and deliberate, in the way that a professional military force retreats when it has made a calculated decision rather than been routed. I watched them go from the eastern edge of the gorge. Bright came and stood beside me. He looked at the retreating Krath columns for a while without saying anything. They'll be back, he said eventually. Not here, I said. Not for a long time. Somewhere, he said. Yes, I said. Somewhere. He considered that. Good thing we'll still be around. He went back to where the squad was cleaning equipment and sorting kit, the ordinary work of soldiers after the extraordinary work is finished. I stood at the gorge entrance for a while longer and watched the Krath until they were small in the distance, and then nothing at all. The Vareth held a formal ceremony 3 days later. High Envoy Sue stood at the head of a gathered crowd in what remained of the nearest population center and spoke about sacrifice and gratitude and the strength of the coalition. He was a good speaker. The crowd was large and exhausted, and relieved in the specific way that people are relieved when something terrible has ended, without taking everything from them. The ninth sat in the back. We had been offered front-row positions and declined. There is something about formal ceremonies that soldiers find slightly uncomfortable, I think, because the thing that is being celebrated is something you lived through, rather than something you watched happen from a distance, and the gap between those two experiences is not easily bridged by ceremony. Petra Hollis was eating again. She had spent 3 days sleeping and eating in roughly equal measure, which was her standard post-campaign behavior. Callum Bright had his shoulder in a partial brace, which he was treating with the same level of acknowledgement he gave to most minor inconveniences, which was almost none. Sergeant Quinn had acquired a piece of Krath territory marker during the command raid, and was using it as a doorstop in his temporary quarters, which said everything you needed to know about Quinn. After the ceremony, Sue found me standing at the edge of the crowd. "The Galactic Council has requested a meeting," he said. "I heard," I said. "They want to discuss your presence. Earth's presence. Several member species are interested in formal protection arrangements. And several others are worried about what it means that we're here," I said. "Yes," he said, without any attempt to soften it. "There are those who are reassured by what happened here. And there are those who are now concerned about humanity in a different way than they were before. Because they saw what we can do," I said. "Because they saw what you are," he said, which was a slightly different thing. Before this, humanity was a member species of moderate standing, an interesting case study in biological extremity, perhaps. A species that had done well despite its origins. Now you are something else in the conversation. "What are we?" I said. He was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "You are the species that the Krath Dominion pulled back from. That has not happened before. It will not go unremarked." I thought about that. I thought about the Galactic Council chamber, whatever it looked like, and the faces around the table that would be studying us differently now. Some of them hoping we were on their side. Some of them calculating whether that was a comfortable thing. "We did not come here to become something in the conversation," I said. "We came because you asked, and because it was right." "I know that," Sue said. "I am not sure the Galactic Council will believe it." "Then we will have to show them," I said. He nodded. "The meeting is in 9 days. I would like you to represent Earth directly, if your command approves." "They will," I said. We stood together for a moment in the quiet of the crowd around us, the ceremony winding down, the sun going low over the western ridgeline beyond the city. Somewhere behind me, one of the ninth was laughing at something Quinn had said. The ordinary sound of a unit at rest, the comfortable noise of people who have been through something together and come out the other side. "Can I ask you something?" Sue said. "Yes," I said. "In the gorge, that first night, when the Krath came in force, were you ever afraid?" I thought about it honestly. "There were moments when I was very aware that the margin was thin," I said. "When you are in the middle of something like that, you are not exactly afraid in the way people imagine. You are focused. There is not much room for anything else." "But afterward," he said, "when you think about how close some of those moments were." I looked out at the horizon. "Afterward," I said, "I think about what we were trained to do, and whether we did it. I think about the person we lost. I think about the ones who are here. And the fear? It gets filed somewhere," I said. "You deal with it when you have time. Right now, I do not have time." He was quiet for a moment. "You are a strange species," he said, and there was no insult in it, just observation. "We have heard that before," I said. He left to manage the last of the ceremony obligations. I stayed where I was as the crowd thinned around me, and the sun finished its way down behind the western ridge, and the twin moons of Vethara came up together over the eastern horizon, large and steady, in a sky that was finally quiet. I had a report to write. Command back on Kepler Station would need the full account. The tactical decisions, the outcomes, the political situation, the state of the ninth. I would write it tonight and send it first thing in the morning. It would be a long document. Military reports always were, because the things that actually happened never fit neatly into the standard categories. How do you write a field report about what it means to be the species that answered when the galaxy called? How do you write a section on the psychological impact on an opposing force that had never before encountered something that did not know how to stay down? You write it plainly, I supposed. You write it in the language of facts and outcomes, and you trust that the people reading it can fill in what is between the lines. I started the report in my head while the moons came up and the camp settled into the quiet rhythms of night. Bright's squad was on first watch. I could hear them moving, the soft, deliberate sounds of people who know how to be in the dark without making it harder. 2 moons, different sky, different world, but the night felt the same the way nights always feel, like a pause between one thing and whatever comes next. Whatever came next would find us ready. That was the only promise we had ever made, as a species or as a unit. Not that we would not be hurt, not that it would be easy, just that we would be ready, because we had always been ready. From the very first moment a human being stood up on a dangerous planet and decided, despite every reason not to keep going. The Krath had asked what we were. We were that. We were the thing that kept going. And the galaxy was only beginning to understand what that meant.